The unthinkable just happened. The $28 billion theme park industry has officially exploded, and the fallout is way worse than anyone expected. Parks that once bragged about record crowds are suddenly cutting hours, canceling shows, and scrambling to explain numbers they hoped you'd never see. Entire lands are half empty, families are quietly walking away, and executives are in full-blown panic. As attendance drops, they tried to hide, finally leak out. But here's the wild part. This collapse didn't come out of nowhere. The signs were there for years, and now the consequences are landing right in front of us, because what breaks next might affect you and your family more than you think. What's happening? For years, the theme park industry carried itself like nothing could ever shake it. These were the giants of American leisure, fed by generations of families who treated a day at a park as a rite of passage. Everything looked unbreakable from the outside. Every commercial, every expansion, every celebration made the industry seem too big, too beloved, and too deeply rooted in the culture to ever slow down. But illusions have a way of cracking in an instant, and this one shattered the moment the real numbers finally surfaced. What had been marketed as steady strength turned out to be something far more fragile, built on assumptions that no longer matched the world outside the gates. The public shock began when internal figures slipped into view, figures that contradicted decades of confidence. People saw financial charts that dipped instead of rising, and projections that suddenly collapsed under their own weight. Families who always believed the industry was thriving realized they had not been looking at the full story. The illusion of unstoppable growth, worth nearly $28 billion in value, had been stretched too far. When it finally snapped, it snapped fast. But the real story behind the collapse had less to do with numbers, and far more to do with how American families changed without the industry noticing. Why American families quietly walked away. This part of the story is not about an attendance decline. It is about something deeper, something tied to identity, and how families decide where their time and money should go. Over the past decade, the American household shifted its priorities. Parents began choosing flexibility over structure, smaller trips over long waiting lines, and experiences that felt personal rather than manufactured. The world changed, and the old idea of spending an entire day inside a crowded park stopped fitting the way many families wanted to live. The parks kept raising prices, but the experience stopped rising with them. Families noticed. They felt the gap widen. What once felt like a reward started feeling like a debt. Instead of excitement, many families saw stress, long walks, loud crowds, and too little value for the money they spent. People did not argue about it, and they did not make dramatic statements about abandoning the parks. They simply drifted away, choosing new forms of entertainment that fit modern life better. Quiet decisions, made one weekend at a time, reshaped the entire industry before executives even realized it. American families did not walk away in anger. They walked away because the parks no longer fit who they had become. And while families changed, the parks themselves had locked into a business model that left no room for that shift. The business trap. Long before the collapse became impossible to ignore, the major operators tied themselves to massive commitments that only made sense during years of peak crowds. They built towering attractions, sprawling expansions, and entertainment complexes that required constant, full-capacity traffic to justify the investment. These projects were not simple upgrades. They were decade-long gambles based on the belief that the future would always mirror the past. Every new project demanded bigger numbers. Every new expansion required streams of visitors measured in millions, not thousands. The idea of flexibility did not exist inside this system. These mega projects worked beautifully when everything aligned, when tourism was high, when families showed up in force, and when the public felt the experience was worth the cost. But the moment life shifted and the crowds thinned, the model turned into a trap. The industry had chained itself to a structure that could not adapt. Executives built for perfect conditions, and when reality delivered anything less than perfect, the entire foundation began to shake. The trap was not about rising operating costs or shrinking margins. It was about a structure that could not bend, only break. And instead of acknowledging the warning signs early, the proof behind the collapse started pouring out in ways the industry could no longer ignore. If you want more breakdowns like this, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. Your input helps shape what we cover next and keeps this kind of deeper investigation alive for everyone watching. The internal numbers. Inside the industry, the first real cracks appeared not in public reports, but in quiet financial summaries that were never meant to leave internal meetings. These documents broke down revenue by park category, and the split between the flagship destinations and the regional properties told a story the executives hoped would stay buried. The flagship parks continued to pull in steady attendance, but their margins were thinning. Meanwhile, the regional parks, once considered the dependable backbone of yearly earnings, had been drifting downward for nearly a decade. The leaked figures revealed that this slow slide began long before the collapse became public knowledge. The numbers showed widening gaps between projected revenue and actual performance. In some regions, the shortfall had grown every fiscal year, creating an internal strain that no public statement ever acknowledged. Analysts inside the companies raised concerns, but those warnings rarely traveled beyond the conference room walls. For years, leadership insisted that temporary promotions and seasonal events would bridge the gap, refusing to accept that the foundation itself had weakened. When these internal spreadsheets finally surfaced, they confirmed what early skeptics had suspected. The downturn was not sudden. It was built into the system, hidden beneath optimistic forecasts and polished presentations designed to maintain investor confidence. The truth had been visible for years, but it stayed buried beneath confidence, tradition, and a belief that decline was impossible for them. And once the numbers came to light, attention shifted to the choices that had produced them. Expansion bets that backfired. Across the industry, expansion had been treated like a guarantee rather than a calculated risk. Executives believed that every new intellectual property would deliver massive crowds, regardless of cultural shifts or changing tastes. They licensed brands that seemed exciting on paper but carried little lasting appeal, and they built enormous attractions around characters or franchises that never developed the staying power needed to justify the cost. As these expansions opened, attendance spikes were brief, and the long-term returns failed to match the forecasts used to greenlight the projects. The parks also invested in sprawling lands that required constant visitor circulation to remain profitable. These areas were designed for peak foot traffic, yet they opened into markets that no longer behaved the same way. Families wanted shorter experiences, not entire zones built around a single theme. The mismatch between design and demand turned once celebrated expansions into quiet burdens. What had been sold as visionary progress became evidence of strategic misalignment, made worse by the insistence that every project must be larger than the last. Internal reviews later showed that many expansions were approved without realistic performance scenarios, relying instead on optimism that ignored shifting visitor expectations and emerging forms of entertainment competition. These decisions created obligations that could not be reduced or reversed, locking the parks into commitments that drained resources steadily and quietly until the underlying structure began to fail entirely. But the expansion misfires were only part of the internal strain. Geography delivered an even sharper blow, regions that became dead weight. Some parks were built in regions that once promised decades of strong attendance, but local conditions gradually shifted in ways the executives never anticipated. Population growth slowed, household income flattened, and the surrounding economies no longer supported the spending patterns that had once justified the initial investment. These parks depended heavily on local and regional visitors, yet the communities around them were changing, shrinking, or redirecting their leisure budgets toward more flexible entertainment. In several areas, the parks faced competition not from other attractions, but from demographic decline itself. Towns that once sent steady streams of visitors now struggled with job loss or outward migration. The parks in those regions became heavier to operate each year, not because of national trends, but because the local foundation they relied upon was eroding. The industry knew these regions were weakening, yet expansion and improvement budgets continued to flow into parks that could not realistically grow. Analysts warned that these regions required a completely different approach, one built on smaller attractions and community partnerships, rather than large capital projects designed for markets with rising populations and expanding tourism that could sustain long-term stability. Instead of adapting, leadership continued to apply national strategies to regional problems, creating a widening gap between what the parks needed and what they were given. A gap that grew until the underlying viability of those locations weakened beyond recovery entirely. And behind all these regional struggles was another root cause. The consequences began to surface in ways no executive could control. Park operators forced into survival mode. Park operators entered survival mode the moment the illusion of stability collapsed, and the first signs appeared long before guests noticed anything unusual. Behind the scenes, managers were forced to make fast decisions that cut deep into the daily rhythm of the parks. Entire ride teams were consolidated into smaller crews, and schedules that once ran like clockwork became patchwork arrangements meant to keep the gates open with fewer hands. Popular attractions began operating on reduced hours, not because of maintenance, but because there simply were not enough trained workers to staff them safely for full days. Shows that had run for years were pulled quietly from the schedule, leaving empty stages and confused guests. Seasonal events that once anchored the calendar were trimmed, simplified, or canceled without explanation, creating gaps in the experience that regular visitors recognized immediately. The parks also pushed back opening dates for new attractions that had already been announced. Construction walls stayed up longer, and promised experiences were delayed again and again, turning anticipation into frustration. Older rides, once kept in steady rotation, were shut down for stretches that lasted far beyond typical refurbishment cycles. Guests assumed these closures were temporary, but staff members knew they were part of a triage process meant to stretch limited resources as far as possible. Operators were not saving money. They were buying time, hoping stability would return. They waited, and while operators struggled to hold the system together, the workers inside the gates felt the strain even more intensely. Workers caught in the crossfire. Workers found themselves caught in the middle of a storm they did not create, and the weight of the industry's struggle settled directly onto their shoulders. Many employees saw their hours reduced with little warning, turning once predictable paychecks into unstable guesses about what each week might bring. Schedules shifted constantly, often changing the night before a shift, or even the same morning, leaving workers scrambling to balance family obligations with the unpredictable demands of the park. The lack of consistency created stress that spread through break rooms and across ride platforms, where veterans who had spent years building their skills suddenly questioned whether their roles still carried any security. Burnout rose quickly as staff members were asked to cover roles outside their normal duties. Ride operators became parade attendants. Food service workers found themselves stepping into custodial tasks. Show technicians were reassigned to queue management. None of these changes were framed as cost-cutting measures, but everyone understood what was happening. The parks were fighting to maintain the illusion of normal operations, relying on the dedication of people who cared deeply about their work, even as conditions deteriorated around them. Some employees held on out of loyalty, while others felt trapped because nearby jobs offered even less stability. Conversations once filled with guest stories shifted toward exhaustion, frustration, and a sense something worse coming. And beyond the gates, the collapse began stretching far past the parks themselves, reshaping entire communities built around tourism. The tourism ecosystem begins to crack. The collapse did not stop at the park gates. Entire local tourism ecosystems, built over decades, began showing the strain as soon as visitor patterns shifted. Hotels that once relied on steady waves of families noticed rooms staying empty during weekends that used to be fully booked months in advance. Shuttle companies saw fewer passengers moving between airports, hotels, and entrances that once stayed busy from sunrise to closing time. Small restaurants positioned near the main roads leading into the parks experienced quieter lunch rushes and half-filled dining rooms where lines once wrapped outside the door. Even souvenir shops, long considered safe bets thanks to seasonal visitors, watched sales drop as foot traffic thinned across entire districts. Suppliers felt the pressure as well. Bakeries that provided daily deliveries to hotel breakfast buffets reduced production schedules. Laundry services that handled thousands of linens per week saw orders shrink. The ripple effect spread through every layer of the regional economy, touching businesses that had little to do with theme parks beyond proximity and timing. Many owners described the change the same way. sudden, quiet, and unsettling. They had built their livelihoods around predictable tourism flows that no longer behaved predictably. The ecosystem depended on constant motion, and once that motion slowed, cracks widened into visible fractures. The strain spread outward, and guests eventually felt consequences more clearly across every visit each time. If you want to stay ahead of the next major shift in the entertainment world, make sure you subscribe. The stories coming next will change how you see this entire industry, and you will want to hear them the moment they land. The experience guests receive has never been worse. For visitors who still made the trip, the decline became impossible to ignore. Lines grew longer, even though fewer guests were in the park. Entire attractions operated with reduced capacity, leaving families stuck in stalled queues that barely moved. Shows that once ran reliably every hour were trimmed to a handful of performances, forcing visitors to choose between waiting for entertainment or rushing to the next shrinking offering. Food locations opened late, closed early, or cycled limited menus that frustrated guests who remembered when variety was part of the excitement. The overall experience no longer matched the expectation built over years of tradition. Parents noticed the difference first. Kids asked why certain areas felt empty, or why once beloved rides did not open until afternoon. Guests paid more, yet received less, a combination that eroded the sense of magic the parks once protected so carefully. Even simple services, such as strollers or lockers, became harder to find during peak hours. The wear and tear on visible spaces told another story. Animatronics malfunctioned more frequently, staying offline for days. Details that once defined the park's standards slowly slipped as the workforce struggled to maintain impossible workloads. By the end of the day, families left feeling tired rather than enchanted. Guests noticed smaller details slipping everywhere. And as guest experience deteriorated on every level, the industry could no longer pretend the fallout remained hidden. New competitors move. The collapse of the $28 billion theme park sector did not leave an empty field. It created an opening, and the companies waiting on the sidelines wasted no time moving in. Gaming giants expanded their reach with hybrid digital worlds that feel as immersive as any amusement gate ever did. Streaming platforms launched interactive story experiences, pulling guests into narratives without asking them to stand in the sun for hours. Travel resorts built all-inclusive packages with built-in flexibility, promising comfort without the long hauls and rigid schedules the megaparks demanded for decades. These competitors did not try to copy the parks. They went after the emotional payoff the parks used to own, the sense of escape, the thrill of discovery, and the promise of shared memories. Instead of building steel coasters, they built digital immersion, spaces, narrative hubs, and resort-style environments designed for a world where families want freedom instead of commitment. Each challenger targeted a sliver of value the parks abandoned, and each found an audience ready to spend. The vacuum left by the parks became an ecosystem for innovation, not imitation. And the companies filling the gap are moving fast, confident that the old giants no longer have the strength to push back. But the private sector was not the only realm forced to rethink its future after the crash. Cities and governments rethink tourism itself. Local and state governments watched the collapse unfold with an uncomfortable realization. They had built too much of their planning around an industry that turned out to be far more fragile than it claimed. For years, cities offered subsidies, tax holidays, zoning exceptions, and infrastructure upgrades to keep parks growing. After the collapse, those same cities began to question whether the return had ever justified the support. Urban planners reevaluated entire districts shaped around tourism, recognizing that single anchor entertainment zones were a liability, not an asset. Some municipalities redirected funds toward mixed-use development intended to draw year-round residents instead of seasonal crowds. Others reconsidered transportation projects originally built to funnel visitors to a single gate, repurposing them for broader civic use. Environmental regulators also stepped forward, questioning land use expansions that once passed without resistance. In council meetings across the country, the debate changed tone. Instead of asking how to help parks grow, officials began asking what else could take their place. A few cities even froze pending park expansions, waiting to see if the industry's old promises still carried weight. The political mood shifted from unquestioned support to careful scrutiny, and the long-standing assumption that parks were indispensable suddenly felt outdated. While American cities reevaluated their priorities, the international stage began to react in its own way, the shockwaves reaching across the globe. The collapse in the United States sent a ripple through global entertainment markets that had long looked to American parks as bellwethers of stability. Investors who once considered these parks untouchable began pausing new commitments in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Large projects already in development were quietly scaled back, redesigned, or halted entirely. Emerging markets that had hoped to build destination parks reconsidered the timeline, questioning whether the American downturn signaled a structural shift rather than a temporary slump. International developers noted how quickly confidence evaporated once the American numbers broke, and they began reviewing their own models with a sharper eye. Some regions looked at domestic demographics and realized they lacked the population density to sustain megaparks under modern expectations. Others studied the American collapse and concluded that diversified entertainment portfolios would provide better long-term resilience. Even countries with strong tourism flows faced hard questions from financial institutions, suddenly wary of repeating the American mistake. The global industry found itself in a rare moment of hesitation, as though the collapse had exposed a pressure point nobody wanted to acknowledge. What began as a national crisis became a worldwide recalibration. And from that recalibration emerged a very different picture of what Americans truly want from leisure. The new shape of American leisure. What replaces the megapark era is not a single trend, but a shift in priorities that favors freedom, flexibility, and low-commitment enjoyment. Families are gravitating toward experiences that offer shorter visits, easier access, and fewer logistical demands. They want leisure that adapts to their schedules, not the other way around. Outdoor recreation has seen renewed interest, from state trails to regional campgrounds, because it allows people to craft experiences without rigid start and stop times. Small-scale attractions, community festivals, and independent entertainment venues are seeing growth as travelers choose authenticity over spectacle. Long-distance travel is shifting as families choose flexible exploration over week-long commitments to a single park. Modern leisure now favors control, spontaneity, and personal pace. The collapse exposed a new rhythm in how Americans unwind, pushing the country toward more adaptable, diverse entertainment options for the years to come. And that's the reality behind the biggest theme park crash in history. The numbers are real, the fallout is growing, and the next few months could reshape family travel across the entire country. But now I want to hear from you. Do you think the parks can recover? Or is this the beginning of the end? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit like, tap subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. We're just getting started, and the next story changes everything.